So a few weeks ago, I was grabbing coffee with an old friend. She heads up the HR department at a major aerospace firm.
Oh, wow. High stakes world.
Incredibly. And for years, she was the one leading the charge, proudly showing off these glossy brochures about equity-first hiring and decolonizing the engineering mindset.
I've seen those brochures.
Right. And she used to talk about these programs with this almost religious fervor. She was convinced they were the key to a more, quote, moral corporate future.
But you're saying used to.
Yeah. This time was different. She looked just drained. She's nursing a double espresso, staring blankly at this stack of folders. And then she shows me this leaked internal safety report on her phone.
Okay.
And it wasn't some political manifesto. It was a cold, technical autopsy of a component failure, one that had nearly grounded an entire fleet.
Oh, my God.
And she just whispers to me, she says, for 3 years, we stopped looking for the person who could see the structural flaw, and we started looking for the person who had the right cultural sensitivity score.
That's chilling.
She wasn't angry. That was the thing. She was terrified. The ideological high she'd been on for years had just slammed head on into the cold, hard reality of a functional shock. Right. Then she does something that just, it genuinely stunned me. She points to a literal dumpster in the alley behind the cafe. There are 2 workers just tossing out stacks of inclusion champion trophies and unconscious bias handbooks.
Wow. Literally throwing it out.
Literally. And she calls it the 2025 Great Retreat. She told me the board didn't have some change of heart or a moral epiphany. Not at all.
It was practical.
It was physics. They simply realized that while you can rewrite a mission statement, you can't rewrite the laws of physics. And that sudden, quiet dismantling, this mass exit of DEI offices across, I think she said 181 colleges in the Fortune 500, it's not just a policy shift.
Yeah.
It's the sound of a system hitting functional shock. It's what happens when a civilization realizes that gravity doesn't have a diversity department. It's the only auditor that actually matters. This, right here, is the clinical anatomy of why that ideological boom is finally hitting its physical limit.
That story is, it's such a powerful illustration of exactly what we're talking about when we say functional shock. It's that moment, the moment when objective reality,
like the integrity of a bridge,
or the financial stability of a bank, or in your friend's case, the actual safety of a flight, it gets superseded by ideological compliance. The analysis we've looked at suggests the system eventually it rejects the institutional structure that threatens its own survival.
And not because of some moral awakening.
Not at all. It's out of stark necessity. It's what happens when competence fails on a systemic level.
So we're basically tracing a line from a philosophical choice made decades ago, all the way to a critical safety report being shredded in an alley in 2025. This isn't just about cultural trends.
No, it's about how these administrative ideas migrate, how they move from academic theory to institutional policy and then right into the engine room.
And what happens when they collide with the cold steel of a non-negotiable reality?
Precisely. We're exploring the foundational reasons systems fail when their primary objective purpose gets displaced. And our deep dive today is structured around 3 core areas.
Okay.
First, we'll look at the institutional root of this conflict.
Yeah.
So the historical rise of this new administrative class and how it displaced traditional goals.
Right.
Second, the mechanism of disintegration. This is where we get into the radical transformation and really the weaponization of language and culture.
And the third part.
And finally, the functional crisis itself, the systemic erosion of competence that leads directly to that moment your friend described, that moment of systemic failure. We'll be digging into the decline of meritocracy in fields like medicine and aerospace, the transformation of elite universities, and the rise of this self-perpetuating administrative state.
Okay, so let's unpack that institutional root first. Because the administrative state my friend was terrified of, it didn't just appear overnight, did it?
Not at all. And to understand why so many modern corporations and governments are run by these administrative coordinators instead of, technical producers, we actually have to look back.
How far back?
To 1941, to a pivotal work by a man named James Burnham. The book was called The Managerial Revolution.
Burnham. Okay, so what was his core premise?
Well, it was profoundly unsettling for the time. He was directly challenging the standard binary framework that everyone was operating in back in 1941.
Which was basically capitalism versus socialism. The two big ideas fighting it out.
Exactly. Most political theorists at the time, they just assumed that if capitalism collapsed, and, a lot of people thought it would inevitably be replaced by some form of state socialism, just like Marx had predicted.
But Burnham disagreed.
He fundamentally disagreed. He argued, yes, capitalism is temporary, but it's not destined for socialism. He said something else was emerging. A new, non-socialist, but still exploitative society was forming right under everyone's noses.
And it was centered not on who owned things, but who controlled things.
Precisely. Who controlled the operations? He identified this rising social group as the managerial class. And this concept it's critical to understanding the institutional failures we see today.
So who were these people? They weren't the old school factory owners.
No, not the capitalists who supplied the funds. These were the people defined by their involvement in the technical direction and coordination of production. Think operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers.
And in government.
In government, it's your administrators, commissioners, bureau heads, the people who actually manage the complex logistics of modern society.
And the key insight here, the thing that's so often missed, is that Burnham argued this managerial class wasn't just working for the capitalists. They were actively displacing them.
Yes. They were the ones with day-to-day control of the mechanisms of production. It made the traditional capitalist ownership class, increasingly obsolete.
He had that great phrase for it, they own things in name only.
That's the one. The traditional capitalist holds the title, the piece of paper, but the manager holds the functional power.
Right.
Exactly. Just, imagine a massive, complex manufacturing plant. The capitalist owner might get the profit, sure, but the administrative engineer is the one who decides how the assembly line is optimized, how labor is scheduled, what the supply chain looks like. That technical control, it translates into real power.
And Burnham believed this class would eventually seize formal power. How?
By implementing state ownership and using the unlimited state as their vehicle for control.
But why the state? Why go through government structures?
Because the state provides the kind of centralization and coordination you need to manage these massive modern industrial economies efficiently. For the managerial class, the state bureaucracy is this highly effective tool for consolidating power. It lets them displace the messy, fragmented control held by all those individual capitalists.
So they don't have to own the means of production.
They just have to control the administrative levers, the permits, the regulations, the state-run projects. That's where the power is.
And he wasn't just theorizing based on, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. He saw the blueprint for this rising power right here in the U.S.
He did in the 1930s with New Dealism.
Really? How so?
He saw New Dealism as an early, maybe still a bit confused, but definitely a managerial ideology. And it was ideological in the sense that it fundamentally shifted the American political center of gravity.
It started emphasizing the state over the individual.
Right. Favoring centralized planning over fragmented private enterprise, and prioritizing things like social security and mass employment over, individual initiative and risk-taking.
So the analysis suggests that the psychological effect of this shift was just profound. It undermined public confidence in the old capitalist ideas by positioning the state as the great benevolent provider, the planner.
It prepared the minds of the masses, as he put it, for the acceptance of a managerial social structure. And this framework, this helps us understand why your aerospace friend's company suddenly found itself structurally incapable of prioritizing engineering quality.
Because the entire apparatus had shifted.
It had shifted toward managerial coordination and compliance and away from the core function of making things that fly safely. The managerial class, at the end of the day, focuses on managing the process, not on producing the result.
It really sounds like the moment the coordinators become more important than the producers, the entire enterprise just loses its bearings.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And this concept, this displacement of functional purpose, it brings us perfectly to another crucial institution that seems to be operating under two competing priorities now: the modern university.
Yes, and to really analyze that shift, we can use an old idea from Aristotle, the concept of telos.
Telos, the inherent purpose or the end goal of a thing.
Exactly. The telos is basically the North Star. It's the fundamental reason something exists. So if the university's North Star has always been truth, what happens when the compass suddenly points to something else entirely?
A new North Star.
A new competing North Star. Historically, the traditional telos of the university, you see it on all the ancient crests and mottos, has been the objective search for truth. But the sources we're looking at suggest that purpose is now fighting for dominance with a radically different goal.
Okay.
When we analyze modern academic culture, you can almost see two foundational patrons squaring off. On one side, you have John Stuart Mill representing what we could call truth U.
And on the other?
On the other, you have Karl Marx representing social justice U.
And their goals, as the sources laid out, are just. They're fundamentally at odds with each other. Mill's vision for Truth U is built on this liberal idea that truth emerges from a process.
A rigorous, often uncomfortable process of intellectual friction.
Right. It assumes that we're all flawed. We all have biased, incomplete reasoning. So to get closer to the truth, we have to constantly challenge each other.
And that model requires two very specific things. First, viewpoint diversity. But second, and this is critical, something called institutionalized disconfirmation.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the certainty that there are other scholars who do not share your motives. They might even actively oppose your conclusions, and they will try intellectually to disprove your claims. This process is essential because it makes everyone smarter. It strengthens the final outcome.
Okay, so that's Truth U. What about social justice U?
In contrast, the analysis argues that Marx's social justice U is oriented entirely around action, specifically changing the world by identifying and overthrowing what it sees as existing power structures and privilege.
So from that perspective, viewpoint diversity isn't a strength.
It's a practical obstacle to action. If your goal is immediate political change, say, the rapid deconstruction of societal hierarchies, then you need uniformity of purpose. You need a unified message.
Debate just slows down the revolution.
It does. And this brings us to what's called the destructive interaction. When one field, let's say social justice, injects its telos, its ultimate goal, like achieving proportional racial equality, into other unrelated professions, well, those professionals are then forced to betray their original functional telos.
This is the managerial class phenomenon, but applied to knowledge.
That's a great way to think about it. Imagine business infecting medicine, where the profit motive overrides the health outcome. Or in the academic world, social justice goals overriding the objective search for scientific truth or historical accuracy.
The function becomes compliance, not competence.
The pursuit of political ends overrides the original institutional mission. And it's interesting because this displacement seems to be accelerated by a larger sociological trend that the sources identify. The shift in American child rearing. The rise of this intensive, high-stakes helicopter parenting that really took off in the 1990s. It fostered a pervasive safety culture on campus.
This generational safety culture. It sees words, books, visiting speakers as potentially dangerous.
Or even as equivalent to violence. And if a student's emotional well-being is seen as the primary institutional product, then intellectual challenge becomes a direct threat to that product.
And this is where the two goals, the two teloses, become absolutely incompatible, right?
Completely. The search for truth requires risk, it requires discomfort and challenge. But if the institution is dedicated to a culture of maximum emotional safety, then any idea, especially a conservative or just a challenging idea that questions the dominant ethos, is very easily labeled as threatening, as dangerous.
Which naturally forces students and faculty who might question things to just shut down, to self-censor.
Of course. And that kills the viewpoint diversity that Mill saw as essential for any kind of intellectual progress. The argument is that a university simply cannot be both things at once. It can't be a rigorous laboratory for truth, which demands difficult struggle, and a therapeutic sanctuary, which prioritizes emotional safety above all else. It has to choose one.
And the structural incentives increasingly point toward the therapeutic model,
which conveniently feeds the administrative state.
So if that conflict of telos is the institutional root, the next question has to be, how is this ideology transmitted? How is it amplified and made to seem necessary across the whole of society?
And the analysis points to the systematic transformation of language. That's the mechanism. It creates this powerful, positive feedback loop for the very managerial administrators we were just talking about.
Okay, so let's start with a counterintuitive paradox that comes out of discourse analysis.
Yes. When you look at broad social surveys, what you find is they consistently document a marked decrease in racial and sexual prejudice across U.S. society. This is over the past 5 decades.
Can you give us some examples of that data?
Certainly. I mean, you see a massive rise in the approval of interracial marriage. It's around 94% today.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, it was under 50%.
It's a huge shift.
Huge. You see overwhelming support for gender equality beliefs and a rapid, sustained decline in the number of Americans who believe that white people are inherently more intelligent or hardworking than African Americans. By many objective metrics, the societal trajectory is one of increasing tolerance, integration, and declining overt prejudice.
And yet, when we stop looking at behavior and belief and start looking at the language being used in the media, the trajectory flips. It goes dramatically in the opposite direction.
Exactly. There's a detailed analysis of the New York Times discourse from 1970 to 2018, and it's illustrative. It shows this extraordinary accelerating spike in the frequency of words used to describe prejudice.
Terms like
Sexism, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia. And this spike isn't gradual, it accelerates dramatically, especially starting around 2011 or 2014, and it far outpaces the actual decrease in the reported phenomena.
that is where it gets really interesting, because it's not just the concepts of prejudice that rise.
No. The sources document a simultaneous and remarkable rise in terms related to victimization. Words like hurtful, traumatizing, bullying, marginalized, oppressed.
And at the same time, you see the rise of the belief system itself.
Right, with an increase in words like diversity, social justice, inclusion, intersectionality, safe space, and trigger warning. The linguistic environment is accelerating the identification and discussion of harm, even as objective social metrics suggest that certain forms of overt prejudice are becoming rarer.
So what the analysis suggests is you're creating a cultural system where the perception of harm begins to outpace the actual presence of harm.
Exactly. And that paradox lists prejudice, but more talk of prejudice, brings us to two fascinating psychological and linguistic mechanisms that help explain this feedback loop.
Concept creep and prevalence-induced concept change.
Let's start with concept creep. This is just how negative concepts expand their semantic boundaries. They start to encompass a much wider range of phenomena.
And this expansion happens in two ways, right? Horizontally and vertically.
Correct. Horizontally is pretty straightforward. You know, the concept of abuse expanding beyond physical or sexual abuse of children to also include emotional or verbal abuse.
But vertically is where the managerial class finds its fuel.
Yes. The definition expands downward to include qualitatively less extreme or even subconscious phenomena. For example, prejudice used to mean overt hostile animosity. Now, the argument is that some academic frameworks have broadened the definition of racism to include simple intellectual disagreements.
Like opposing affirmative action policies.
Or even subconscious thought patterns measured by tools like the implicit association test.
So the bar for what counts as an offense keeps getting lower and lower.
Which means the pool of potential offenses gets exponentially larger. That's the mechanism. What was once a high threshold for actual harm is continuously lowered until benign or just everyday actions can qualify.
And this creep is explained, at least in part, by a core human cognitive bias. This, PICC.
Right. Prevalence-induced concept change, or PICC. It sounds very academic, but the concept is simple.
Break it down for us.
Think of it this way. Studies show that as the actual prevalence of a negative stimulus decreases, let's say you're a lookout and your job is to spot truly threatening faces and they become very rare, your mind doesn't just relax.
It starts to see threats where there aren't any.
It naturally expands the concept of what counts as threatening to include previously benign or neutral faces. The mind is highly resistant to accepting the decline of the phenomenon it's tasked with identifying.
So if you're a professional anti-racism researcher or DEI officer, and your mandate is to reduce racism, but overt racism is actually decreasing, your cognitive pressure is to redefine and expand the concept of racism.
You have to find milder, previously ignored instances just to justify your own ongoing function.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
Precisely. And the sources argue this bias fuels the administrative state because the managerial class depends on identifying and managing conflict. If the conflict fades, their function fades. So they have to continuously expand the definition of the problem.
Which leads directly to the subjectivity shift,
where the element of subjectivity in determining harm dramatically increases. Prejudice or emotional abuse. It's now often framed as existing in the accuser's subjective perception, not necessarily in the objective acts of the accused.
So if I feel offended or traumatized, that subjective feeling becomes the institutional metric. It becomes the proof of harm.
And as the analysis points out, this risks pathologizing everyday experience. It promotes a culture of diminished agency and fragility.
Which brings us to the rise of victimhood culture.
This linguistic and cognitive shift, driven by the managerial class's need to perpetuate conflict, leads directly to the establishment of victimhood culture. And sociologists distinguish this from earlier honor and dignity cultures.
And this culture is characterized by a high sensitivity to even unintentional slights. And crucially, a heavy reliance on third parties.
On administrators, relying on them to mediate any interpersonal conflict instead of resolving it directly.
And here's where the incentive structure just completely flips on its head. The sources argue that victimhood confers moral status,
which creates powerful social enticements for individuals and groups to emphasize their personal or collective disadvantage. This is the moral status incentive.
So instead of being encouraged to be resilient, to solve problems internally, which would be a dignity culture, the incentive is to be seen as victimized. Because that status grants you social currency. It gives you moral authority and institutional attention.
That's the structural problem. The sources point out that this incentive can sometimes lead to the exaggeration or even the falsification of offenses. You see this with some hate crime hoaxes. The institutional reward for having been victimized is just that significant.
And paradoxically, this culture is often most acute in highly egalitarian settings.
Like elite university campuses. Precisely because overt derogatory acts have become so rare. The PICC mechanism kicks in. The search for rare offenses leads to an expansion of the definition of offense.
And this is the perfect feeding ground for that administrative state we saw at my friend's aerospace firm. The rise of this culture feeds the massive, disproportionate growth in bureaucracy.
You see this so clearly in the data on administrative bloat. The sources cite the UC system, for example, where every single professor supports 4.2 administrative staff.
4.2. That's a huge shift away from the core educational function.
It's massive. And crucially, 37% of those new posts are directly linked to DEI or similar compliance offices. The function is administrative compliance, not technical or academic output.
I'm thinking of that story from the outline about the project manager, Marcus, who was working on that state-funded infrastructure initiative. He was supposed to be repairing a crucial bridge.
That case illustrates the structural incentive perfectly. Marcus discovered that for every dollar allocated to the core functional purpose, steel, concrete, labor $2, were being diverted to something called the Office of Equitable Implementation.
And he spent his days tied up in meetings with administrative compliance officers.
People, the sources point out, who had never seen a blueprint in their life. Yet they held total veto power over his hiring decisions and his material sourcing.
Based purely on adherence to ideological checklists.
And by the time the third sensitivity audit was completed, the administrative staff had apparently tripled, but the bridge itself was still crumbling.
So the structural incentive for this new bureaucratic class, it depends not on solving objective problems, but on manufacturing and managing conflict and ensuring compliance.
They ensure their permanent necessity by redefining problems as evidence of systemic oppression, rather than focusing on the objective function of the institution.
It essentially turns the institution into a self-maintaining Ponzi scheme. It drains resources from the productive, functional departments, the engineers, the professors, the doctors, and redirects them toward ritualistic compliance.
We saw this play out so starkly in the analysis of the Harvard budget. The sources found that the DEI office budget exceeded the combined budgets of the classics, mathematics, and physics departments.
The core academic department.
Exactly. And the outputs were entirely non-functional from an academic standpoint. Things like 142 inclusive language guides and 83 anti-bias workshops. This is a massive allocation of resources devoted entirely to institutional self-management and conflict avoidance, not objective excellence or discovery.
So we've established the root, the managerial class displacing the institutional telos. And we've got the mechanism, the language inflation, feeding this administrative parasite. Now we hit the wall. What happens when these corrupted systems encounter non-negotiable objective reality?
The answer is functional shock. And it shows up first and most dangerously in high-stakes fields.
Let's start with medicine.
The systemic erosion of meritocratic standards in medicine is probably the most immediate and tangible threat. A poorly trained doctor can cause significant, irreversible damage. So the politicization of medical schools, it really should be a universal concern.
And we have specific, pretty disturbing data from internal sources here, including whistleblower reports from UCLA Medical School.
Yes, the sources state that admission standards were allegedly and systematically lowered for underrepresented minorities. They were allowing applicants with grades and MCAT scores that would have automatically disqualified white or Asian applicants.
So a clear trade-off. Identity preference displacing academic merit.
And the outcome data is alarming. The internal figures revealed that record numbers of these students subsequently failed basic clinical knowledge exams. They're called shelf exams.
Let's just break down that failure rate, because this is the definition of functional shock hitting the institutional floor. The pass-fail cutoff for these exams is set nationally at the 5th percentile of all test takers.
Right, so you need to score above the bottom 5% of everyone in the country to pass. It's a very low bar. And yet, the internal data showed that in some specific cohorts at UCLA, the failure rates reached 50%.
50%.
Let's just pause on that. Half the students in those particular blocks were scoring in the bottom 5% of test takers nationally. That is empirical evidence of profound academic distress, and it's linked directly to the lowering of admission standards.
I mean, let's just stop on that 50% failure rate. That means if you're going in for a major medical procedure, you could have a coin flip's chance of getting a doctor who struggled to pass the absolute minimum benchmark.
Or who scored in the bottom percentile. That's the real-world cost of displacing the meritocratic telos with a social justice telos. That's reality hitting home.
And this ideological capture, it goes way beyond just admission scores, right? It invades the curriculum, faculty evaluation.
It does, which just compounds the problem. Look at UCSF. The medical school adopted a social justice pillar into its core curriculum. Their anti-racism initiatives included mandating the evaluation of faculty contributions to diversity statements for promotion and advancement.
So faculty advancement, which should be based on clinical excellence, research, teaching skill, is now dependent on demonstrating allegiance to an ideological framework.
And UNC School of Medicine went even further, according to the reports. They urged faculty to adhere to explicit ideological requirements.
Like what?
Mandatory core concepts of anti-racism. These included assertions like race is not a set biological category, and specific organs and cells do not belong to specific genders.
Which directly contradicts biological reality.
Yes. And students were also explicitly called to embrace political causes, like radical reform of the U.S. criminal justice system, or restoring U.S. leadership to reverse climate change as part of their medical training.
So the institution is using its power to coerce adherence to a specific political line. It's redefining medical competence to include political advocacy. And what happens if someone tries to question this with objective data?
Then you see the rise of the trauma defense. At UCSF, task force members claimed to be traumatized and gaslit by employees who constructively questioned or denied concepts of systemic racism. They emphasized the emotional labor they endured just by having their premises subjected to critical intellectual scrutiny.
So in that environment, objective critique, which is the lifeblood of science and medicine, is redefined as a form of psychological violence.
That has to be managed by administrators. The moment the feeling of being traumatized supersedes the pursuit of fact, the functional telos of the medical school is destroyed.
And this systemic erosion has catastrophic implications outside medicine, too.
Absolutely. The substitution of identity for competence in high-stakes technical fields, aerospace, finance, infrastructure, it directly threatens the function of complex Western systems.
I keep coming back to that flight instructor you mentioned, Robert, the one who spent 30 years vetting pilots. He told that chilling story about a flight simulator.
Yes, with a top-tier candidate from an accelerated program. This pilot had all the right credentials on paper, but when a simulated engine failure occurred, a high-stakes, time-critical event, the candidate didn't immediately reach for the manual override.
Or start calculating the glide slope.
No. The candidate froze, froze, looking for a non-existent digital prompt on a screen.
And Robert realized that the old, rigorous, washout-style testing that used to define aerospace training,
the kind that demanded an almost intuitive, gut-level grasp of physics,
had been quietly softened to ensure representative success rates. The candidate was academically successful, but they lacked what Robert called the raw meritocratic scars.
The scars of someone who had been forced to fail, to struggle, and to achieve intuitive mastery under extreme objective pressure.
That pilot lacked the functional mastery born of brutal, objective vetting. The system prioritized compliance with the new internal safety culture over actual, raw competence.
And we see this dynamic creating real financial shock, too. Look at Silicon Valley Bank. The sources report that just 9 months before its collapse, the bank's risk management team was prioritizing candidates with diversified leadership certificates over those holding chartered financial analyst CFA certification.
That is the classic managerial class displacement. And when the bank collapsed, it wasn't because of a lack of sensitivity. It was because the foundational technical risk management was incompetent.
The auditors who mattered, the laws of finance, delivered the final objective verdict.
Or think about the project manager and the infrastructure paralysis again. He watched as critical funding for bridge repair was consistently outpaced by allocations for the Office of Equitable Implementation.
And the administrative compliance officers, who had no technical knowledge, held veto power based purely on ideological checklists. The bridge remained unsafe while the compliance metrics soared.
So in these cases, administrative compliance becomes the substitute for actual functional output.
It does. And this phenomenon exposes the linguistic contradiction the sources call inclusive excellence. That term itself illustrates how prioritizing representative success rates, which just means identity compliance over competence, grants institutional power to the mediocre.
The sources argue this is a passive corruption.
Yes, it's not necessarily active malice. It's a systemic corruption that rewards administrative compliance and eliminates differences through the systematic lowering of functional standards. If excellence is defined by who achieves success, and you lower the requirements to ensure that specific demographic groups reach predefined metrics, then excellence itself becomes diluted.
It's the functional shock mechanism at work.
Prioritizing comfort and compliance over the non-negotiable requirements of the physical world.
And the ultimate consequence of all this, the sources suggest, is the dissolution of objective reality itself within these elite institutions. It's like Christopher Lasch's prophecy from the culture of narcissism is fully realized.
Where the university has retreated from being a truth laboratory into becoming a therapeutic sanctuary, where intellectual challenge is managed as an emotional threat.
And this retreat shows up in explicit policies that undermine intellectual rigor in favor of emotional management. You see what the sources call cognitive retreats.
Like listing math anxiety as a formal psychological service at a major university like Michigan.
Or Yale Law School, suggesting that professors provide emotional safety warnings before discussing constitutional law cases.
Exactly. The core mission of rigorous intellectual development is being replaced by fragility management. We're essentially teaching students that the pursuit of truth is secondary to their feeling of safety. The analysis argues this is creating a generation of managers who just cannot handle the complexity and uncertainty inherent in the real world.
Which brings us back to that story of the student Elena in that conflict resolution workshop in early 2025. She wanted to be a scientist, to find objective truths.
But instead, she found herself in a place where the primary goal wasn't to discover what is true, but to ensure no one felt, quote, decentered.
And the sources describe that scenario where she tried to cite biological data in a debate objective, verified data, and the moderator stopped her.
Right. And not because the data was factually wrong, but because the impact of the data was deemed harmful to the collective emotional safety of the room.
That is the crucial pivot point. She was stopped not by counter-evidence or a flaw in her methodology, but by the perceived negative emotional impact of the fact itself.
And this leads to a systemic loss of the ability to withstand what the sources call the hardness of objective reality.
If a survey shows that 43% of undergraduates believe that being offended is equivalent to actual harm, then rational objective debate is structurally impossible.
Because the highest value is no longer truth, it's emotional maintenance.
And if you follow that trajectory to its logical conclusion, you're looking at civilizational entropy. When subjective feeling replaces objective fact as the standard for institutional arbitration, in medicine, in engineering, in finance, society necessarily begins to regress to a lower energy state.
The university stops producing problem solvers who are equipped to handle complexity, and it starts outputting fragile subjects who require lifelong psychological support.
This systemic institutional regression, it's the clearest warning sign. that we're facing a deep, fundamental crisis of competence.
Where the managerial class's adherence to compliance overrides the foundational ability of the entire system to function.
So that 2025 Great Retreat, quiet dismantling of the DEI apparatus your friends saw in that dumpster.
The sources are clear. It's not presented as a moral epiphany on the part of these institutions. The argument is that it's a necessary biological rejection, a rejection of a parasitic institutional structure that was threatening the survival of the host body.
The system faced functional shock.
And its only response was to shed the non-functional organ.
But the sources also make it clear that just changing the name of the diversity office to, say, the Office of Excellence, that doesn't fix the corruption of the incentive structure.
No, that took a decade to embed. What's required is what the sources suggest is a bone marrow transplant of rebuilt standards, restoring competence-based screening, reestablishing fact before feeling as the primary institutional telos.
Ultimately, what we've been talking about, it sounds like the ancient war between civilization and barbarism.
It is just manifested in the 21st century as the collision of ideological political identity with the non-negotiable standards of competence required for any complex society to function. Meritocracy, for all its flaws and imperfections, is argued to be the only social sorting mechanism that isn't founded on a fundamental lie about ability.
So the path forward for an individual, the sources conclude, demands a kind of stoic endurance.
It means insisting on mathematical truth, demanding data validation over ideological compliance in every single meeting, refusing appointments based on identity rather than ability.
Every individual who upholds functional standards, every classroom, every hiring decision that prioritizes competence.
They become micro-fortresses against this civilizational decay, against entropy.
We have to keep those fires of competence burning brightly.
When future historians sift through the ashes of our current age, the presence of a few shattered cornerstones marked fact, competence, and excellence will serve as the ultimate silent proof that some still refuse to deify subjective feeling and instead sought to build order based on objective reality.